Today I'm out in the drizzly forest with the all-new BMW i4. If this looks familiar to you, that's because this is essentially an electrified 4 Series Grand Coupe. This is part of BMW's multifaceted strategy when it comes to electrification. They're going to be electrifying a bunch of models, including vehicles like the i4, which again is an electric 4 Series, and also bringing us a bunch of dedicated electric-only vehicles like the new BMW iX. Somewhere logically in the in-between is probably going to be the new recently announced BMW i7, which is going to start out as a full electric vehicle, but there are also going to be other formats of that at some point later. Also, we're going to be getting a full electric flagship from BMW at some point later, not to be confused with the i7. Up front, the i4 looks a lot like the rest of the BMW lineup, and definitely a little bit less distinctive, I would say, than the new BMW iX. We have the large kidney shapes right there, borrowed from the rest of the 4 Series lineup. Obviously, they're blocked off because EVs don't need as much cooling. Full LED headlights here, no fog lights down below, but lots of functional aero treatments all the way around. Be sure and let me know what you think about BMW's enormous beaver tooth grille down there in the comments section. I have to say, I don't think I mind it quite as much as most folks seem to, and it certainly hasn't done anything to hamper BMW's sales. At 188.5 inches, this is on the long side for a compact luxury sedan. Although this is a sportback or a liftback, whatever you want to call it, this entire section opens up, but it does have sort of an imitation trunk lid right back here. The i4 is related to the 4 Series Grand Coupe, which is of course based on the 3 Series sedan, which is why this is right in the same neighborhood size-wise as a 3 Series, a C-Class, a Model 3, perhaps a Polestar 2, etc. But unlike some of those other options, and more like the gasoline cousins, we have a very long hood here. And that's because the 4 Series Grand Coupe was designed with BMW's 3-liter inline-6 in mind. And the distance between the front of the vehicle and that dashboard is incredibly long. It is about double the distance of some really compact electric vehicles. Now, you might assume that that would give the i4 a really big front trunk like we find in some Tesla models, but you'll be disappointed. We'll cover that a little bit later. The long hood design definitely gives this a very attractive look and a very different look than we find in some modern EVs. Under the body, BMW gives us a battery pack just over 80 kilowatt hours in usable capacity. It's around 81.5 kilowatt hours or so. And that battery pack stretches from just about behind the front wheels to just about in front of the back wheels. Speaking of wheels, this particular i4 has the optional 19-inch wheels and tires on it. It's a staggered arrangement, 245s up front, 255s in the rear. Selecting this option will drop your range from just over 300 miles down to 282 because these wheels are just not as aerodynamic as the base model. As you'd expect out of an electric BMW, we have blue accents on that BMW logo. I have to say, I think this wheel look is worth the reduction of 20 miles of range. We also have some pretty beefy brakes up front. Out back, things look very much like the rest of the 4 Series lineup. We have full LED taillights here, a little bit of a spoiler right there on top of the Sportback lid, and cutouts here for what would ostensibly be the exhaust, but here they're just aero treatments to help smooth the air as it comes out from underneath. At the moment, the i4 is going to come in two different power levels, 335 horsepower rear-wheel drive or the M50 version, which is a dual motor setup giving you 536 horsepower and a promised 3.7 seconds 0 to 60. This particular model is the rear-wheel drive version, which makes the lack of front trunk a little bit head-scratching. When you look under here, you'll notice we have this enormous bank of plastic, and on either side we have some little access ports, but you can completely remove it here, and if I pull that out and set it aside, you will notice that 22-inch roller bag will actually slot right in there. And that's logically because there is a ton of room under here. This hood was designed to accommodate BMW's inline engines, their twin turbo engines, etc. So there is just a ton of room going on. And there is still some room going on even in the dual motor version of the i4. Now, powering the electric motors is one battery pack common to both versions. It's 83.9 kilowatt hours nominal, 81.5 kilowatt hours usable. So BMW is pretty confident in this battery pack because they're letting you use an awful lot of it. Charging happens in the back. As you'd expect, it's in the same location as the gas door in the regular 4 Series Grand Coupe. There are two ports here, an AC port and a DC port. There's an onboard 11 kilowatt charger that will charge this battery from empty to completely full in around 8.5 hours or so. If you have access to the appropriate DC fast charge station, you can go from 10% to 80% in 31 minutes. That's a pretty respectable time for a vehicle that does not support 800-volt charging. Instead, BMW opted for high current 400-volt charging, but you will still need to find one of those 350 kW DC fast charge stations in order to charge at 210 peak. Fortunately, I was able to find one earlier today, and I was able to verify BMW's claim. We hit 209 kW, and this hung out well over 100 kilowatts for quite some time as the battery charged. And we went from 10% to 80% in 30 minutes, so a little bit faster than BMW's claim. EPA range is going to vary based on the model and the options you select. If you get the base tire package on the base model of the i4, you'll get 301 miles of range. If you choose all of the options on your M50i, then range is going to drop down to 227. With the plastic cover off, we might as well take a look inside. Down there you can see the compressor for the heat pump system, also some hoses, electric pump right there. There's a DC-DC converter that looks to be for the 12-volt system. There's a 12-volt battery right over there on that side. The struts are likely here to help this conform to crash standards, because once you've removed the engine, there may be some additional reinforcement and structure changes needed in order to still comply with crash standards, since the engine is not going to be down there. But you can see there's definitely a lot of room. Now, the axle in this vehicle, you can see, is sort of right around there or so. So an electric motor would need to be right in that area, just in front of that large cast aluminum piece right there. You can actually see the steering rack, that really kinky part right there, connected right there to that electric rack. So even though the electric motor would take up some space and its inverter module would likely take up some space, there's still some room available down here. Now, I know you've heard me defend vehicles that don't have a front trunk, but here's the thing. Something like this front trunkless Ioniq 5 or that EV6 over there, they have a very short hood. So it's rational that there's no storage area under there, because it's simply not that long. In fact, dashboard to front of the vehicle here is nearly 20 inches shorter than the i4. And what about a Tesla, you say? Well, this is actually substantially similar to the i4 in terms of dashboard to front of the vehicle. This is a little bit shorter, actually, meaning that you could definitely put a usable storage area in the BMW if you really wanted to. When it comes to cargo capacity, the i4 does pretty well, although the number appears to be a little small on your screen. To be honest, I think BMW's measurement is wrong, because at the time that I received this, they were telling me 10 cubic feet of cargo space back here, and that just doesn't seem possible, because this is about the same size and will fit the same number of 24-inch roller bags, which happens to be 4, as a lot of crossovers with the cargo area much bigger than 10 cubic feet. Generally speaking, 10 cubic foot trunks will only fit 2 24-inch roller bags. I suspect this is more like 23 or 24 cubic feet, probably substantially similar to something like the Kia EV6, maybe a little bit smaller than a Model S. I've asked BMW for clarification here. The number is likely due to the way that BMW is measuring cargo capacity. It's likely a different standard than other companies use. So if the number on the side of your screen is bigger than 10 cubic feet, that's what's going on. Fortunately, the i4 retains a lot of the cargo practicality we find in the 4 Series Grand Coupe, including 40-20-40 folding rear seats, a little bit of extra storage capacity on either side, and then if we lift up the load floor, there's a teeny tiny bit of storage under here as well. This is where we find the subwoofer for the vehicle, and this is also where we find the included dual voltage EVSE. As you'd expect, front seat comfort is very comparable to other BMW models because the seat design is very similar. Although I don't think the seat bottom cushion tilts as much as some BMW models, so I did find that gave me a little bit less leg support than I really wanted. We have a tilt telescopic steering column. It's a manual design but gives us a large range of motion, and we have a 2-position seat memory for the driver. The front passenger seat does not have the memory, but it moves in the same way as the driver's seat. As you might have assumed, with the very coupe-like profile in this vehicle, headroom is definitely a bit more limited than in the 3 Series. The back seat is certainly going to be tighter than some dedicated platform electric vehicles or obviously the BMW iX, but that goes with the sort of sleeker profile that we find in here. With the front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have about 4 inches of legroom left, but you'll see that my legs are pretty high off the ground, and I actually don't have my shoes on now because they were a little bit muddy from being outside. Moving over here to the middle, we find climate controls, USB ports, and not a lot of headroom. I really can't put my head back there to that headrest, and I'm not entirely clear that I can even get, oh, maybe I can. Right here behind this front seat that's all the way back in its tracks, I just barely fit because there's not a lot of legroom going on here. Several inches less than we find in the Model 3, actually quite a bit less than we find in the Model 3. Now, in the i4's defense, the front seat track does move further rearward than some of the competition, and that means that we get less space in the rear if you do have a taller person up front. But the taller person up front would need to be mostly legs because the ceiling is relatively low thanks to the power moonroof. And of course, to help improve practicality beyond just that simple sportback design, we get a 40-20-40 folding seat back. I really love this feature because it means you can put skis or long items or IKEA furniture in here and still be able to carry 4 people around. On the inside, you'll definitely notice that the i4 looks a lot like the 4 Series Grand Coupe. We have the same sort of just slightly oversized sunroof. It does open right over the driver and front passengers' heads. The rear compartment definitely has a little bit less headroom than we find in the BMW 3 Series. We find fixed in-place shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger and 4-way adjustable headrests. The front seats feature a very BMW design. The leather is perforated, but it's not ventilated in this model. We have pretty aggressive side bolsters and extending thigh cushions. Those are manual. The styling of the doors and the majority of the dashboard is very traditional BMW. Lots of soft touch materials, premium materials, stitched bits going on, lots of ambient lighting as well. You can see the ambient light strip right there in green just under that sort of imitation metal trim. We then find real metal trim over here on the dashboard with more of that faux metal trim there. Pretty decently sized bin-style glove compartment right here. Definitely enough room for a 10-inch tablet computer inside. Soft touch, stitched upper section of the dashboard. But then across here, things start to get a little bit interesting. The i4 gets the new twin-screen iDrive setup that we're going to see in other BMW models. The most interesting thing about this is the way that it's mounted on the dashboard. You can see it has sort of like this little foot here, and it floats a little bit above the dash in a very modern feel. The look of iDrive 8 is definitely also different than before. It's still controlled either by a controller here in the center console or a touchscreen interface. The most interesting and perhaps the most controversial thing about iDrive 8 is that we no longer have physical climate control buttons. You'll see instead we have this climate menu option. That's where we adjust things other than temperature. Temperature stays down there on the bottom, but this is not slider. You just tap one way or the other to adjust the temperature. Over here on menu, you'll see a host of apps, a lot that we saw before in iDrive, but definitely a different way of interacting with the apps on the screen. This is definitely much more touch-oriented than previous versions of iDrive, although you can still use the controller knob to interact with the system. Expect the vast majority of this to make its way to other BMWs without a plug at some point. We have Android Auto, Apple CarPlay there. Over here on the charging screen, this is where we find some of the unique features just for this electric vehicle. You can choose the charging target, AC limit for AC charge cables, and typical things like when you want the vehicle to charge and a departure plan for preconditioning the cabin. As you'd expect, there's a trip computer readout inside this display. One of the interesting things is it gives us the amount of energy regenerated back into the battery. 15.2 kilowatt hours over the last nearly 280 miles. Under the instrument cluster, we have 2 large air vents, a few physical controls, no preset controls down here anymore, just volume, track forward, backward, and then defogger and defroster. We then have an area where you can secret away your smartphone. There's a Qi wireless charging mat in there. That's definitely important because Apple CarPlay is wireless in here. There's a single USB port there, 2 big cup holders, 12-volt power port, a pretty typical joystick-style BMW shifter. Drive is back there. We then pull over to the left for the enhanced braking mode that engages the one-pedal driving. BMW does let you change the amount of throttle liftoff regen you get. It's controlled in the infotainment system in there. To the right of that, we have the iDrive controller that I showed you earlier, drive mode selector knobs down here, buttons for the 360-degree camera system, stability and traction control, parking sensors there, and then a blue start-stop button. You'll also notice the blue accents all the way around. There's blue trim right there on the shifter. Over here, we have the electric parking brake, softly padded center armrest, and then a fairly small storage compartment because the large hump that would normally be occupied by the transmission is still here because a lot of the structure is shared with the BMW 4 Series Grand Coupe. Now let's look at one of the more interesting features in here by setting a destination to somewhere. And then if I move over to this, you'll notice that this is the first vehicle that I can think of with a multiple display implementation of Apple CarPlay. This map shown right now is actually being driven by the iPhone down there in the wireless charging mat. Now this particular feature only functions if you're using Apple Maps, and it's a little bit difficult to see in the rain, but you'll also get turn-by-turn directions from Apple Maps up there in the heads-up display coordinated with the map over there on the instrument cluster and over here. This is really handy because it means that you can be doing infotainment over here and still get the moving map display over there, or of course you could pull up Waze if you wanted to, and that's definitely a handy feature I think if you want to have Waze up and you want to have your mapping interface over there on that side. BMW then overlays the vehicle's auxiliary displays on top, and that can change based on your layout. So if I go over here and toggle the layout, you can see that we have various different layouts but we still have that Apple Maps implementation being displayed right there in the middle of everything. Thanks to the nature of electric motors, the i4 feels a bit faster than the numbers would indicate. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 5.5 seconds. That's a little bit faster than some, but there are definitely even mainstream electric vehicles like an all-wheel drive EV6 or an all-wheel drive Ioniq 5 that will go 0 to 60 faster than this. Of course, there are a few Mach-E's that will go faster than this as well and cost a little bit less than this base model. Of course, keep in mind that most of the faster competition is going to be dual motor. This is a single motor model, so not exactly the most valid comparison, but price-wise, they're going to be quite similar. In my 60 to 0 braking test, it took 118 feet for this to stop from 60 miles an hour, so this definitely is going to take a little bit longer than the average gasoline version of the same vehicle. There's no way around the added weight of the battery pack on board. The battery pack is fairly centrally located, and you'll definitely notice the low center of gravity. This has a great feel to it. There's not a lot of body roll, not a lot of tip and dive. The suspension is very well controlled on a wide variety of road surfaces. And when it comes to handling, I'm certainly going to give this an A. This isn't going to grip the road quite as well as some of the competition, or obviously some versions of the BMW 4 Series Grand Coupe, but it does very well for itself. And keep in mind, this does not have summer tires on it. This particular model has all-season tires. Obviously, grip and handling will vary based on the options you select and the version of the i4 you get, whether you get the single motor model or the dual motor model. I'm really intrigued to test out the dual motor version of the i4 because a lot of new electric vehicles that have a powerful electric motor on the front axle tend to have a little bit of torque steer, a little bit of vague steering under hard acceleration, and I'm not sure if that applies to the BMW as well. The reason that doesn't happen in a traditional gasoline BMW is that they send the majority of the power to the rear axle, and that solves that particular problem. But in an electric vehicle where there's a separate electric motor up front, we don't have that same ability. Out on a rougher gravel road like the one that I'm on here, you'll definitely appreciate the adaptive suspension system. In comfort mode, it's fairly compliant. I give the ride quality in here an A- for a luxury sedan. There are definitely going to be some softer options out there, but this doesn't have the same sort of firm and bouncy ride that we find in a Tesla Model 3. As far as ride quality goes, even when this is in sport mode, this has a better ride than the Model 3. That comparison would also include the Ford Mustang Mach-E because it was tuned very much like the Tesla Model 3. Now, the top-end version of the Mach-E GT, which is logically in a similar price range to this i4, it does have an adaptive suspension system that definitely solves some of that, but it's not going to handle quite like this because it is going to have skinnier tires. As far as ride quality goes, this is actually one of the best rides available in a modern EV. Something like a Tesla Model S will ride better than this thanks to its adaptive air suspension. Same thing with the Porsche Taycan, but those are both going to cost you significantly more. When the road gets narrow, you'll definitely notice that this cuts a nice tight corner like that. I definitely think that out on the road, the i4 drives a little bit smaller than a Porsche Taycan or a Ford Mustang Mach-E, even though dimensionally this is actually very similar to those vehicles. Like other modern BMW models, this has electric power steering, but I think they've done a good job tuning the assist, and what tiny bit of feedback we get from the front axle is definitely welcome. If you're looking for an EV with a bit of a sportier vibe to it, I think the i4 is an excellent option. Not only does this drive a little bit smaller out on the road, I think that everything is well balanced, from the steering to the suspension feel, etc. BMW just did a really good job assembling the i4 and designing all of the vehicle control systems. I also love the adjustability here. If you're not a fan of one-pedal driving, or if you would just like the option to adjust the one-pedal driving, then you're going to want this over a modern Tesla. BMW's one-pedal driving mode is not as aggressive at taking you to a complete stop on a wide variety of different surfaces and inclinations. If you're even on a very gentle downslope, the vehicle will continue to creep along more or less at about 1 mile an hour. But if you're on a level road surface, then it will take you to a stop and, of course, keep you there. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of one-pedal driving modes. I prefer more moderate throttle liftoff regeneration, and that is something that is definitely very adjustable in the BMW. We also have the adaptive mode if you'd like the vehicle to decide for you. And of course, you have the option of very easily toggling between the two by switching this from D to B, so you can easily get that extra braking if you want it. In my cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, I measured 70 decibels in here, which makes this definitely quieter than the average 4 Series. I think that has to do with the battery pack location and the extra insulation it provides in terms of road noise into the cabin. But keep in mind, on these particular tires at least, on a rougher road surface, the noise definitely ratcheted up. So if I were to go out on an open highway that had some really poor pavement, things are going to be a little bit louder in here, I think, than some of the EV competition, and a little bit more comparable to the regular BMW 4 Series. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging between 3.1 and 3.4 miles per kilowatt hour. That's within the range that you'd expect in a vehicle with a 282-mile range and the battery pack that we have on board. This will fall, generally speaking, for most shoppers a little bit below the EPA rating, but a little bit closer than some of the competition. So if you're comparing this single motor version of the i4, for instance, to a 300-mile range Tesla, in the real world, they're probably going to be relatively similar because this is closer to its EPA rating than we find in the modern Tesla lineup. Although it is worth noting that most Teslas are generally speaking going to be more efficient than the model that I'm driving here. For instance, the high horsepower Model S that we have at the same time as this, it averaged 3.6 miles per kilowatt hour. That's a little bit off its EPA score, but it is definitely more efficient than the model that I'm driving here. And keep in mind, that's a dual motor model, this is a single motor model, and there are a few other EVs out there like the new EV6 and the Ioniq 5 that are very similar to this in dual motor setup. They actually have a little bit better performance than this 0 to 60. Dual motors means all-wheel drive, and they're going to be a little bit less expensive. In order to keep the YouTube algorithm happy, you'll now find pricing and comparisons in a second video. Just watch this all the way to the end, hit the pricing and comparison button on the lower right-hand side of your screen. In the meantime, be sure to hit the subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen as well if you haven't already done so. Find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those other social places, and we'll see you over there in part 2.